Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good night, depending on where you are. This is night, by the way, here. So my name is Youngrong Lee. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Actually, I'm very nervous because I feel like my presentation will go over 50 minutes, but I will try my best to keep that shorter than that. So for today's presentation, I prepared a piece of the study, piece of the research that I'm conducting right now. So this is a part of my dissertation project, and I make this title: "Working in Crisis: Organizing with Crisis Comparative Perspective of Gig Workers Unions in Seoul and Toronto." So again, this is a part of the bigger project, which is my dissertation project, that is a transnational comparative study of gig work and gig workers unions in two cities, Seoul and Toronto. So right now I'm conducting my fieldwork in Seoul. So this is really a piece of bigger story that I keep analyzing. So any feedback or question could develop my study and my research will be really appreciated. So in my dissertation, I situate unions as a key meso-level actor to mediate the macro level, which is global economy, and the micro level, heterogeneous individual workers. So this is a brief overview of my methodology. So my dissertation is global comparative ethnography that is composed of field participatory observation and in-depth interviews in two cities, Toronto and Seoul. So I conducted my fieldwork in Toronto last year for about 1 year. And this year, since last June, I am conducting my participatory observation and in interviews with workers, organizers, and stakeholders in Seoul. Okay, so my research is involved in two unions, Gig Workers United in Toronto and Greater Toronto area, and Riders Union in Seoul. You are looking at in two pictures. So these two unions are both delivery gig workers unions and industrial unions, not a union based on one company. They are embedded in the different historical and social context of each society and each city. So Canada and South Korea actually share several features in labor, such as increasing precarization, the erosion of unions, exclusionary mainstream unionism, as well as the non-employee status, such as independent contractors in Canada. And in Korea, we have this special category like special employees that is partially only recognizing the characteristics of employees. So I believe that it is quite a similar concept with the independent contractors in North American context. So there are many things that I have been observing in my field, but not yet ripe enough. So today I'm going to only focus on piece of the preliminary findings on how these two unions tackle crises, the various crises, and how they organize through that. So first, in Toronto, so Gig Workers United, the union had the interconnected crisis, which is the exit of Fedora and the COVID pandemic. So before Gig Workers United, this union was a Fedora Workers Union, which is Food Stores United. And in April 2020, Fedora suddenly left Canada in the middle of the pandemic. Unions, gig workers, and journalists understood this as a company's response to the favorable climate for the union after the decision of the labor board. And after Fedora left, Fedora unions, the workers union, launched it to the Gig Workers United, an industrial union. So Joey, one of the organizers, Joey's interview quote shows vividly how these two crises are inseparate each other and they're very much connected. So she said in the interview, the union changed a little bit when COVID-19 came to Toronto because, we overnight become essential workers. And so without any PPE. And so that changed the union and put the union in the sort of position of like our work in our jobs has to be keeping people alive, right? Foodora left during the pandemic, and the pandemic had already started at a point kind of just to heighten that to just an extreme degree. So as you can see here, these two crises, I named the double crisis, the losing jobs because of the Foodora's departure and the pandemic were really challenging for the union, and that even got them to change, to really adapt it to this new situation. So how does Gig Workers United organize and support workers in the midst of those crises? First, they needed to tackle the economic urgency that workers were faced with. So the union union organizers, they wanted to make sure workers get the government help available, such as CRB, Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So they provided workers with information on this fund so that they can take advantage of. So for example, they had information sessions on the CRB. Because navigating this bureaucratic process is not easy for many people, especially if they are new immigrants or those who don't have this information. And also there were at first a lot of confusion about who would qualify or not. So the union wanted to provide all the with all the information for the workers. And also the union organizers helped people to get a job from other companies, the platform companies, to substitute the earnings from Foodora that they had. So these were, in this quote, again, Joey said, for me, there was tracking other app companies and which ones were hiring and what are their requirements for hiring and who can get a different apps. And I had written out various kinds of text and we just saved them in the notes on my phone so that I could send them to people. So these were also discussed in the union meetings I observed as well. So union organizers checked in with workers in the meetings to see how they're doing and where they were working at the time since the Foodora left. And the pandemic was also very critical point to shed light on the social inequality tied to the gig economy workforce. So in Canada, like the US, Europe, or Australia, gig work is a largely immigrant job. So, as Colin, I really have no time to read, so I'm going to just summarize he said. So as Colin, who was another organizer, said, it became an important political work for the union to raise awareness on who does the work and who were taking the risk to deliver food to your door. And lastly, union supported workers by building a community of workers and community union. The union arranged food share boxes for workers who need it during the pandemic. And indeed, many union workers I spoke to pointed out that was a huge help and such important support for them during the pandemic. And the union created this hardship fund to provide some financial relief to at-risk couriers who were economically struggling. And moving on to the Seoul case. The union, the writers' union, in Seoul, there was also a global pandemic, right? Throughout the globe. So the union also wanted to support and advocated workers during the pandemic by distributing masks to the more marginal workers. And also they demanded that platform companies should provide gig workers with proper PPE. So they did. Bemi, which is the largest and the most popular platform in Korea, they provided hand sanitizers and masks for the workers. And even Baemin decided to pay sick leaves for some vaccinated workers, not all, but some who were regularly working for their company. Yeah, and then those who were quarantined because of the pandemic. And so the Riders Union, they had another everyday crisis that they always needed to deal with, which is safety crisis. For the last 3 years, the death of motorcycle drivers in Korea took up approximately like 16% of the total deaths caused by the traffic accident. And it is largely related to the soaring numbers of delivery workers in Korea, because the majority of delivery workers are motorcycle riders in Korea, like other Asian countries like Vietnam or Thailand. Therefore, tackling this everyday safety crisis is the most important issue for the Riders Union. And many demands and activities were directly or indirectly concerned with those safety issues. So, Riders Union, they saw the huge achievement, which was passing the revised bill for the industrial accident compensation insurance. So the main idea for the revised bill was repealing the exclusivity clause, and that happened this year. So for that, workers, the unions did lots of activities, such as press conference and protest and performance here. So on the red picket, it says repeal the exclusivity clause in the insurance bill. So for thanks to this achievement, from next year, gig workers can benefit from the industrial accident compensation insurance bill. Okay, one of the main demands of the union is algorithm transparency, because it nudges workers to violate the traffic rules and speed, which jeopardizes worker safety along with the low delivery fee. So the union conducted their own experiment with the union members, including non-union volunteers, to examine the algorithm, because no one does, right? So, and then one of those pictures was taken from the press conference to present the result, part of result from the experiment. And one of the important conclusions was that as you abide by all the traffic rules, you will definitely make less money. Okay. And the union provided various information, like the Gig Workers United did, various information and education sessions, but on about the workplace safety because of this everyday safety crisis. So yeah, so I don't have much time, so yeah, I will leave that about this. And also, lastly, I noticed that climate change has become a great challenge for outdoor gig workers for the union's activities, because the job is working on the road, literally working on the road, right? Waiting, working, resting, and riding on the road. So this extreme heat wave, extreme cold, flooding, and heavy rain are getting more frequent because of the climate change. And those climate-related issues became an important agenda of the union. So the union provided with those safety gears to equip with, for example, like ice water or cooling mask and so on. And like you see here, so workers needed these sleeve protectors to protect their skin from the sunburn and also heat as well. And this was the picture from the campaign that I joined last summer to distribute ice water in a bag so that it can keep cool a little longer. So union organizers are working with the local politician to expand the resting areas throughout the Seoul for this everyday climate issues, right? So that they can shelter themselves and then rest. Okay, this was the picture from the one of the resting spot. Okay, I feel really have no time, so I will come back if there is question on that, but these were some pictures from the protest of the climate change action and then conference, press conference. And lastly, it actually paid off because it created a favorable climate for the workers. So the Paymin, again, the largest delivery company, even stopped operating the app during the typhoon in Seoul and Greater Seoul area for the sake of the worker safety. So to conclude, I wanted to show in the presentation the union's critical role in economic and political and social crisis, and how these impact are so much related each other. And also I'd like to emphasize the importance of gig workers unions in various crises, especially, and because the gig workers tend to be at the bottom of the labor market. And these various crises really make that clear how to be a gig workers and how to be a precarious workers in those crises. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention, and I will look forward to the discussion. And sorry for the going so much beyond the time. Thank you.
No problem. That was great. Thank you, Youngrong. Luna, you're up again. So Luna was in our previous panel, so she's on double duty today.
Yeah. Hi again, Brent.
Hello.
Hi again, Kelly. So let me share my screen. That was for the last one, and okay. So hi everyone. I'm honored to be here delivering my second presentation today. So for some of you, this intro might be repetitive. My name is Luna Xiaolu. I'm a recent graduate from Osgoode Hall Law School, York University. I currently work as an articling student at a law firm practicing employment and labor law. And this is my very first academic conference. So please bear with me, who is not a true scholar yet. I would appreciate any constructive feedback. So some background of this paper, I originally wrote this paper in Professor Valerio Di Stefano's course. Professor Di Stefano, who is the Canada Research Chair in Innovation Law and Society, is generous to use his research funds to support students with their paper publications. And I'm one of the lucky students who benefit from that. Here, I want to show my respect and appreciation to him, even though he is not here. Without further ado, let's have a look at my research questions. So there are three major questions in this paper. The first is, why is automated decision-making systems, aka ADM systems, popular, and what are the problems? And the second question is it possible to build technical measures on algorithmic discrimination that is created by the ADM systems? And the third question, why do we need to take affirmative action towards algorithmic discrimination? So based on the three research questions, my paper will be structured in this way. In the background section, I will define ADM systems and algorithmic discrimination. Then I will discuss ADM systems pros and cons based on literature review. Briefly speaking, an ADM system refers to a computer program that can automatically make predictions, recommendations, and decisions based on data sets and rules input by humans. ADM systems can learn over time through data and information inputs and then adapt to changes in the environment. This process is commonly called machine learning. From the literature review, ADM systems could generate algorithmic discrimination and cause significant consequences to workers, employers, and the society. A group of scholars believe that an ADM system is a black box that would go out of control. Meanwhile, another group of scholars argue that an ADM system is a panacea for business inefficiencies and labor shortages. This paper, however, will argue that the ADM systems are instead a glass box with the potential for monitoring statistical measures and controls by humans. In this paper, I will discuss the reasons for the algorithmic discrimination and potential measures proposed by different empirical studies. Then I will review existing legislation on artificial intelligence, data use and human rights, as well as employment labor law from an international and comparative perspective. Based on the current legal framework, I will argue that we should apply affirmative action to the anti-algorithmic discrimination, and that the minorities as white model, as proposed by some legal and economic scholars, could be a helpful technical measure for taking such a performative action. Built on the literature review and qualitative analysis, I will also discuss regulation proposals related to ADM systems in the employment context from employers, workers, and unions perspectives. Now, what we can see is a brief summary of ADM systems' impacts on employment fairness. In the paper, I will mainly address the shortcomings such as discrimination due to training data that is inaccurate, biased, or unrepresentative. Note that systemic discrimination may still exist if prediction is accurate and consistent, but the training data is biased against a certain minority group. For instance, the leading e-commerce company Amazon had to completely shut down its hiring algorithms, which yielded an extreme disadvantage for female job applicants due to the problematic datasets that include historical bias against females in the IT industry. There are more critical reasons for algorithmic discrimination, such as the proxy effects. For instance, even if programmers erase all gender or racial sensitive data, AI could still use certain career breaks as proxies to recognize women, or use postcodes or names to identify visible minorities. The proxy effects raise a serious concern on some of the current regulatory approaches that require ADM systems to be colorblind. Empirical studies have shown that simply removing gender or racial sensitive data from ADM systems do not necessarily reduce discriminatory results. The current legislation in Canada, the US, and European Union do not specify restrictions on ADM systems' technical components. The legislation in force generally focuses on ADM results impacts, which means we can only decide whether or not an algorithm is legal after ADM predictions have been made. However, this is not to say that we could never measure algorithmic discrimination until we see the consequences. The result-oriented approach may come from the current anti-discrimination law to combat human discrimination in litigation cases. In Canada, the establishment of prima facie discrimination focuses on effects instead of intent. Similarly, Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights does not set intent as a necessary factor in proving discrimination. In the US, though intent may be a factor in the court's judgments, the court has taken conflicting approaches to address substantiating impermissible motives with admissible evidence. So the result-oriented approach in litigation cases avoids unnecessary evidentiary burdens on human rights complainants, thus serving the purpose of promoting access to justice. It does not mean that human decision-making is a black box. Similarly, we cannot conclude that the ADM systems are a black box simply because the current law focuses on the impacts. The good news is that some scholars found empirical evidence that supports the possibility of building technical measures to examine ADM systems' direct and proxy effects. Rather than excluding all race or gender-sensitive data throughout the ADM process, specific statistic models can de-identify individual candidates during the predicting process, thus not giving differential treatments to individuals based on their gender or race. This process is close to the formative action that governments have been using to combat human discrimination from human decision makers. Affirmative action refers to policies or procedures that aim to remedy the results of historical and systemic inequities, eliminate discrimination among applicants or candidates, and prevent such discrimination in the future. Examples of affirmative action in employment include outreach campaigns, targeted recruitment, as well as employee and management development focusing on women and visible minorities. In Canada, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms seeks to guarantee that all people are treated equally and recognizes that discrimination has occurred in the past. So corrective measures, or say affirmative action, are necessary to ensure equality of opportunity. Accordingly, the minorities as white model proposed by legal economic scholars, Yang and Dobie, enables system to be trained with data containing historical and systemic inequities among different groups. In this way, the system may have a holistic database similar to how humans can have a holistic view with awareness of diversity and differences. Also, this model is set to not give differential treatment to individuals based on specific demographic characteristics when making decisions or predictions on an individual basis. Therefore, the system is instructed not to adversely impact individuals based on the protected characteristics, aligning with the core legal concept of discrimination in Canada, the US, and European Union. Therefore, this proposal theoretically brings us one step forward towards using machines to take affirmative action and theoretically provides visible statistic tools to monitor and control the process of taking such affirmative action. However, note that this paper does not propose that all ADM systems should directly apply this model in their algorithm. Instead, this model can be potentially used as an auditing tool to examine and measure possible algorithmic discrimination generated from the ADM systems, similar to the Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition method that has been used by labor economists to examine gender inequities in wages. In addition, statistical evidence could be potentially available for litigation. Overall, this research potentially fills the gap between legislation focusing on legal impact and scholars' proposals focusing on the ADM techniques. But of course, the proposed model and the formative action approach are not yet perfect. For instance, though the minorities as white model can significantly reduce algorithmic discrimination, it cannot eliminate such discrimination, and it remains uncertain whether algorithmic discrimination exists if the ADM system under examination generates lower direct and proxy effects than the testing result from this model. Though this problem may not be solved technically, unions can, however, reach an agreement with the employer about the lowest acceptable level of direct and proxy effects from the ADM system. Unions may negotiate with the employer to adjust the standard of the statistical measurement tool within the legitimate limit set by legislation. This is where workers' rights to collective bargaining is crucial in regulating algorithmic discrimination. And I will give a more critical analysis regarding the pros and cons of the proposed approach in my paper. Due to time limit, I will end my presentation here. I welcome any feedback. Thank you all.
Okay, great. Thank you, Luna. So next we have Steve. So you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready to go. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see if it's going to work. Hold on. Yeah, my screen cracked over the weekend, so I had to rush and get a new computer. So I'm just figuring out how to use it now.
Okay.
But let's see. Why is it? I apologize. Okay, so if I close this, there we go. I knew I could do it.
Perfect.
And it's been a long time since I've done a conference presentation, so please forgive me. I'm going to do a slideshow. This should do it. Okay, great. So, hello, everybody. My name is Steve. I'm in the Department of Politics at York. This presentation is an amalgamation of three major projects that I've worked on in the past and that I'm continually working on. So it's part of my master's degree fulfillment requirement research, which was I did a major research paper on the restructuring of work in the new economy back in 2006. I was a graduate student at York, and I looked at the automobile industry and the rise of lean production and how that restructured, full-time work to part-time contract work. And then it's also an amalgamation of some of my research that I'm doing now for my dissertation, which is more into political theory and ideology. So I'm studying the rise of the right in the United States particularly, and how they mobilize for their movements. And it's part of also a third project that I do on the side, which is for Universal Basic Income Works, UBI Works Canada. I just do some voluntary work for them. So there is a bit of a bias here, so I will make that clear, but hopefully you can gain something from this presentation. So the title of my topic here for today is Neoliberalism, which I will define as libertarianism, and we'll get into that, and gig work as the new economy. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to, what's the justification for research? I'll discuss the research questions. You'll see like the research methodologies. This is going to be a very theoretical approach. This is not going to be an empirical or, a positivist approach. It's going to be focused on ideological shifts that sort of allow the gig economy to flourish, right? You need an ideology in order to have a gig economy to be accepted and normalized. So I'm going to focus on these ideological foundations. I'm also going to historicize gig work. How did we get here? I mean, how did we get to the point where people are not working full-time jobs and having health benefits? And, those seem like foreign concepts to a lot of people. And how are we, getting here, or how did we get here? And I will, make the case that we did get here, not just through ideological shifts, but also I would argue that it actually has roots in lean production that started in the 1980s. It has roots in the automobile industry, which then, when it became successful, that business model it transformed all other businesses and everyone started following it. And then I'll also address whether or not, gig work as freedom or exploitation. Believe it or not, a lot of people don't see gig work as a form of exploitation. A lot of them do see this as a freedom of choice, as a free, voluntary contract, and many are willing to accept it. And so the question is it truly freedom or is it exploitation? And then I'll talk about the future of gig work. And, is this the new normal? And then I leave the question unless, which I'll propose some changes. Okay, so justification. So restructuring, like work restructuring initiatives in the business literature, if you were to read like like a business textbook in administration, or if you were to read the writings of libertarians such as Hayek or conservatives, they see like selling labor power in the market as a form of freedom. This is not a problem. In fact, this is their definition of freedom. And so they have instilled in sort of our culture that, we are free to choose our jobs. If you don't like your work, you're free to leave, so to speak, right? And that ideology has been along for a while, but it's very prevalent today. And I guess the question that's kind of confusing, the conundrum, is how has low income and precarious work under a gig economy become normalized as a form of freedom when it forces workers to work more under uncertain conditions? It seems a bit odd that we would have an acceptance of this without massive backlash or a general strike to get rid of gig work and demand full-time employment. It seems that we're accepting this. So how is this possible? And I argue that, gig work is largely unsustainable as it prevents unionization, full-time work benefits, hierarchical mobility in the workforce. And the income inequality that we're seeing today is unprecedented, right? Which leads to my next point. I mean, it's almost surreal that we have billionaires, flying into space, and people can't afford the basic necessities of life. Like home ownership, for example, is no longer, something that's attainable for most people, right? Yet we have billionaires flying into space. And in many cases, those billionaires are seen as heroes, not villains. Elon Musk is a good example. There's a sector of society that worships him, that thinks that, flying to Mars is a great idea, despite the fact that we have very serious economic problems. So that's a justification for this research. It's why I put it together. So let's start with sort of the ideological foundations of gig work. Like, in order for an economy to exist, there has to be an ideology that's accepted to justify it, right? It has to be believed, it has to be perceived, there has to be at least some form of consent. And I would argue that gig work is largely rooted in libertarian ideology. Now, I could pick a lot of different libertarians, but I'll just pick on two that I think are the most significant and that are not as talked about as frequently compared to other libertarians. Most talk about Milton Friedman and his sort of free to choose, research and his propaganda campaign in the 70s. But in fact, I will talk about Robert Nozick and Frederick Hayek. So libertarianism as neoliberalism. So prior to neoliberalism, which started in the 1980s, right, there was an ideological rift that happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. And that was a movement called libertarianism. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this term, it's really not well known in Canada, but in the United States, it's a very valid ideology that is accepted. I mean, it is mocked for many reasons, but it is considered a valid ideology. And it really just means a minimal state theory. It argues that individuals are free to engage in voluntary contracts without the interference of government, right? And that capitalism left on its own will work out to be the most, will create the most efficient outcomes. And they define capitalism as, the ultimate definition of freedom. Capitalism is freedom. It's only when the government steps in is when you have things like force and, oppression and whatnot. So libertarians, this ideology, while in and of itself didn't take off, it did definitely start a sort of restructuring of, a welfare state that did exist in the 1960s that was robust into, the era of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and neoliberalism. So how do they justify this? And these ideas, while they're academic, they also permeate into society, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But let's first discuss some of the ideas. So Nozick provides the philosophical and deontology justifications of libertarianism and neoliberalism. And I don't know if anyone's here is familiar with his work. One of his, most, notorious, well, not notorious, but one of his most famous works is Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And in that book, he argues, I mean, I'll just stick with the section on the state. So he argues that, so there was a famous, he uses a lot of hypotheticals. He's an analytical libertarian philosopher. And he argues that, there was a famous basketball player by the name of Wilt Chamberlain. And whenever he played a game, he wanted to get paid more. And he wanted to charge, he wanted people to pay more for tickets because he was playing. And because people were willing to pay more, therefore, Wilt Chamberlain deserves to get more money every time he played a game, right? And Nozick argues that that is just fundamentally a truism, right? He's an individual. If he decides to play a game and more money is produced or is spent as a result, then therefore he's entitled to that money. It is a violation of his individual rights for the government to try to tax that, take that away and redistribute it. Because if he didn't play those games, then those tickets wouldn't have been sold. So this is where you see this sort of individual rights argument that's so prevalent today. And Nozick argues that, the owners of private property and those who sell their labor power are free to decide the terms of employment without government interference, right? And why? I mean, from a deontology perspective, it's because we are individuals. We have free will. We have our ability to make our decisions. The government has no right to step in and tell us what to do on the very virtue of being a human being. So it gets very philosophical. And no one is forced or can be forced into a voluntary contract or a voluntary association. So that's Nozick's angle. Hayek is more in the economist lane. He's used more by economists, and he argues that in a very similar way to Nozick, but on a different scale, he argues that the paramount ideas are the individual, not the society, right? And he argues the paramount importance of the personal private sphere, which is sort of the foundation of the end of society that's involved with neoliberalism. And so Hayek justifies all working conditions, provided it's voluntary. And I won't get into the hypothetical that he uses, but just for time's sake, but he uses hypothetical to justify his argument. So these, among others, we can call them traditional intellectuals that emerged around the 1970s, and they gained a lot of popularity. So they sort of, the role of the traditional intellectual is to educate the public on, ideology and what's right and what's wrong. So this helped shifted the idea of a Keynesian welfare state to a neoliberal state, right? And how is this sold? How is this sold to the public? How do you tell the public that we're going to take away your, the welfare state? Well, it's very much rooted in this, long-standing ideological foundation, largely mythical foundation, which is the American dream, right? Everyone can participate equally and can always start over. It is reasonable to anticipate success. Success is a result of individual characteristics and actions under, there are your control, and success is associated with the virtue and merit. Right. And so that's sort of the American dream that many people buy into and believe. And I know we shouldn't use memes in a presentation, but this created the foundations for trickle-down economics that we saw in the 80s. And, it's kind of, as you see here, we told them that trickle-down economics would work. And obviously, we know that that's not the case. So what does this have to do with gig work? Well, the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s set into motion the obsession of radical individualism in the economic and capitalist cultures, right? So this set into motion the idea that the individual sovereign is more important than any type of social or egalitarian principle, right? As a result, this eliminating concepts of class structure from public discourses. We don't hear on the news anymore anybody talking about the working class, aside from a few. We don't hear about class structure, right? We hear about the individual. So we do focus on the individual, and Nozick argues there are no classes, there are just individuals, right? And I would go even further. In the gig economy, it's not just that we're individuals, it's gone one step further, and we are all micro-capitalists. We are all owners of our own means of production. So the gig economy is, allows us to accumulate capital. It's the ultimate form of freedom that libertarians tend to believe in, and the right tends to believe and propagate. And just to give some historical understanding of gig work, gig work has kind of always existed. This is not a new thing under capitalism, right? And I would urge anyone, if you haven't read it already, is Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, right? And this describes, immigrant workers coming from all over the world to the United States, and they would essentially wait around factories to find work. And if they, a factory owner needed a worker, they'd go outside and they just pick someone to work, and then they would work them to death, and then literally work them to death. And when they could no longer work, they would just find somebody else because there was just such a mass supply of labor at the time. Right, so gig work technically has always been around, but now it's more prominent and more pervasive. And so I won't get into too much into Harry Braverman in the Labor and Monopoly Capital School, but I will get into the idea that there is the idea of in the 1980s that really shifted within the work culture was this idea of lean production as a form of worker empowerment, right? So again, in the workplace, we saw this sort of restructuring of not just the work itself, but the language around work actually became, it shifted and sort of changed the culture, right? So this is, you're not exploited, you're empowered, right? You have group meetings and whatnot, et cetera, right? And just to give a basic definition, lean production just means doing more with less. It redefined language in workplaces to make it seem like worker empowerment, right? And they have ideas such as profit sharing started coming into play, again, feeding into this idea that we're micro-capitalists, this idea of just-in-time production, which was initially designed for inventory, but it became sort of a justification for jobs as well, just-in-time jobs, as they're called. So you hire people only when you need to, and you let them go when you don't need to, as opposed to giving them full-time work. And just to give you an example of how the discourse has changed in the workplace.
Steve,
yeah,
you got to wrap it up probably within the minute, if that's
okay. Sure. Yeah, I'm.
Or 15.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So as you can see, the language has changed in the workplace. We see motion studies to continuous improvement, scientific management now is called total quality management, et cetera. Right. So all of this with lean production that happened in the 80s and the 1990s, it's no surprise that when we have the rise of the smartphones and applications, it made finding gig work a lot easier. Right. And I call that the Uber phenomenon. So, and I'll end on this note, like Libertarian Party presidential candidate said, Uber everything. Right. And that seems to be accepted. So, how do we solve it? Well, there's UBI, there's normalizing democratic socialism, unionizing, and sort of getting that into motion as well. So thank you.
Okay, great. Steve, sorry to cut you off there.
No, it's okay. Sorry, I should have kept a timer.
Keep it on sketch.
Yeah.
Okay, who do I have up next? Well, it doesn't really matter, but Gerard. Oh, you're the last presenter anyway.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Okay, so this basically is sort of some preliminary research that I hope to sort of eventually work into my dissertation. I'm still, I guess, technically a PhD student because I'm not writing my comps until next month. So basically the idea is just taking a look at what's been going on in gig worker organizing internationally and seeing, what can be learned or taken from to understand maybe how could it affect these effects have an impact in organizing in Canada. And so sort of I'm really focusing on sort of like the organizational question, because there's a lot of different organizational forms happening in other countries. So like what organizational forms for gig workers have been effective globally, and what global lessons can be taken and applied to the Canadian context. And so these are just some of the preliminary findings that I've had with everything here. So the strength and weaknesses and the overall orientation of national labor movements matter. And I include orientations there because, as we'll see, that obviously some unions and some labor movements within their national context are approach sort of gig work or non-standard or precarious workers very differently, and I think that has an effect. And sort of that ties into the influence of organizing traditions, has an impact of whether or not unions will go after and try to organize certain types of workers. And obviously, generally with some of the countries that I've looked at, established unions, they tend to see gig workers as labor market outsiders, and that has an effect on both their ability to organize them and sort of different organizational forms that have emerged. And also tied into this, I think, really, the resources that unions have, I think, really can have an effect on the success of organizing. So this is like just a preliminary typology that I've somewhat put together looking at these cases. So basically, when I say traditional union, it's basically a larger established union with a sizable memberships and obviously often bureaucratic. Rank and file unions are small unions with an anti-capitalist ideology and a commitment to democratic and non-bureaucratic structures. And self-organization, the workers coming together to organize change in their working conditions without formal or outside institutional structures, although they can operate as a sort of a loose association, but they're not necessarily quite structured like unions, whether they're traditional or rank and file. So the first country that I looked at is in Italy. And what you have there is you have these small self-organized collectives of couriers that work alongside like rank and file unions. And this obviously comes about because traditional unions in Italy, obviously, once quite powerful, they have generally been somewhat, they're basically lack of interest, particularly when it comes to gig workers and non-traditional workers. They're just not equipped to deal with workers that are outside of the traditional collective bargaining system or labor laws. And so what's interesting sort of in the Italian case is that these rank and file unions are not trying to necessarily bring in the gig workers that they organize alongside as formal members, but they are working alongside them to do, protests and everything like that. And these smaller rank and file unions sort of, got experience from organizing migrant workers in the logistics sector through quite militant tactics in the 2000s and early 2010s. Now, what's sort of interesting, one thing I did find though, is that these rank and file unions, they took their idea of tactics, which was quite popular for them, obviously in the logistics center. Blockading a warehouse is obviously going to be a very effective form of protest or strike in the logistics center. But the couriers themselves were not particularly enthusiastic when some of these rank and file unions wanted to basically blockade the restaurants themselves that they were picking up their food through the food delivery apps, because the couriers saw that their issue was with the app and not these restaurants on their own. So that's sort of just an interesting idea of how opinions can be split and differing views of what tactics would work best in this case. And while there have been some significant mobilizations, one of the big problems, though, in the Italian case was basically that these rank and file unions and these loose collectives, they don't have the kind of resources that traditional unions do, and so that's an issue with sort of sustaining them over the longer term. And in South Africa, you see some similarities. You have Uber and Bolt, which is a South African company, and sort of they're the main competitor to Uber there. The drivers in the major cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town, they self-organize themselves into collectives using WhatsApp groups, and they hold like mass meetings in like parking lots and open areas where democratic decisions are made. And so, what I find so interesting in the South African case is, if you look at the history of like a organization like COSATU, I mean, they played in a very sort of, I think, underrated role in sort of organizing like working class resistance to the apartheid system, and really played a major role in bringing that system down. So one would think maybe that sort of commitment to social movement unionism would, affect how they go towards gig workers and non-standard forms of employment, but that's not sort of the case. What they're dealing is obviously, since the end of apartheid, is heavy deindustrialization, and so they are essentially trying to hang on to the membership that they have, and so that they often see gig work and just non-standard employment in general as a threat to their members. And this is also sort of linked to the confused response that these unions have had towards outbreaks of xenophobic violence in South Africa. The unions will put out releases deploring the violence, but they don't necessarily do anything on the ground and sort of organize against such xenophobic sentiments. And this is important because in South Africa, like gig work is heavily gig workers are heavily made up of migrant workers from other countries in Africa. And again, in South Africa, much like in Italy, you have the situation where the strikes are defensive. They're lasting 2 or 3 days over issues like fuel price hikes. So this year there have been a couple of 2 to 3 day strikes in large cities protesting what's been happening to the fuel prices. And so, but those are only sustained, and basically the associations will take it as a small victory if the government says, okay, we will sit down with you and talk over sort of the issues you have, obviously with no concrete guarantees or anything like that. And there's also the issue of when you have a lack of resources, you can't sort of publicize yourself. So there's a lot of drivers in the large cities that simply are unaware that these associations exist. And in the United Kingdom, you have really what's sort of gig workers, and in this case, ride-hail drivers, but also food couriers as well. They've joined a rank and file union, the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain. But what happened originally is that some ride-hail drivers in London, they tried to organize with a traditional union like GMB, who also represented traditional taxi cab drivers. But the problem was, at the same time that GMB was like, well, maybe we'll take, on the sort of Uber drivers. They, at the same time, the taxi driver local was basically running campaigns saying like ban Uber from London and that sort of thing. So that ultimately became untenable for the ride-hail drivers. And so what you have is some really interesting organizing. Uber drivers in London, not exclusively, but heavily of a Muslim background. And so basically they took that to heart in their organizing strategies. The meetings were not in pubs. They offered iftar meals during Ramadan, and they accommodate prayers during meetings and demonstrations. And also one interesting tactic that was developed that one would think of maybe not so something that a radical union would do is that they have used strategic litigation to advance their goals, but it's not, at the same time, it's not a substitute for organizing and direct action. And there have been some victories. There have been some court rulings that have not made them full employees, but have recognized sort of Uber drivers as a certain type of employee, I suppose, somewhat similar, without going into British labor law. They're entitled to some rights, but not full employee rights. But that came because of the court cases launched by the ride-hail drivers. Now, though, the ride-hail drivers did split from the IWGP in February 2020 to set up a union of their own, the App Drivers and Courier Union. So without getting into all of the details, of which I am not completely sure of just accusations made on both sides, but that such a split, I don't think, is necessarily some sort of complete refutation of the strength of this sort of strategy in these rank and file unions. I think it's something more of a lesson to be learned to understand, what are the tensions and why that these unions would split. But at the same time, both after the split have been committed to sort of keeping a union, a form of a union, of a democratic rank and file union. And so going into the Canadian context, obviously, what we've seen is Cup W organizing the Foodora Couriers in Toronto. Now, of course, Foodora pulled out, but Cup W sort of continued on as Gig Workers United. But at the other end, we have something very different with the UFCW's deal with Uber, which basically gives UFCW representation rights to Uber drivers when they have issues about conditions or deactivation. But ultimately, I mean, they're not formal members of. They won't be formal members of UFCW. They're not voting members. They really don't have any say over how that representation is carried out and everything like that. So I think that is sort of a huge tension that's going to be there within what happens to gig worker organizing in Canada. And so the question is, obviously, we can see what UFCW is doing, but is Cup W up to the task of organizing gig workers, given what's going on, and sort of looking at what's worked and what has caused issues in other countries? And I would say that I think they are, in part because of their history and traditions. I mean, this is a union that got bargaining rights for postal workers basically through wildcat strikes. They were ahead of they played a major role in making mat leave something in collective agreements in the early 80s. And they carried on a long fight to get the sort of rural and suburban mail carriers recognized as a bargaining unit. And the rural and suburban mail carriers are mostly a female workforce, and that they were, and originally Canada Post basically said that considered them to be independent contractors. So you can sort of see sort of a similarity there to sort of the debates around, what are gig workers and everything like that. And I think ultimately, and what's sort of promising, at least in the case, and goes to sort of the Cup W versus UFCW, is that, as the Globe and Mail reported, UFCW alongside Uber was basically trying to lobby the Ontario government not to make changes to the Ontario Labor Relations Act, basically that would allow gig workers to be considered employees. So they sort of want to keep them there in that sort of independent contractor status. Whereas, Cup W obviously has a history of bringing in gig workers, or sorry, independent contractors and getting them as into formal employment. And I think really this is that sort of big line that sort of runs through all of these countries' examples is fundamentally like, if the major unions are not going to see gig workers as basically sort of legitimate workers, as however you want to define them, as sort of threats to their membership, Organag is not going to go very far. They're not going to be able to organize them, and gig workers are going to go either to sort of self-organization or to rank and file unions. I think sort of some of, though, I mean, there's still some issues to be resolved. I think challenges for Cup W and all of this. Ultimately, it will come down to the use of strategic litigation. As we've seen, it has worked in Britain, but there's also a tendency for Canadian unions to become a little too reliant on court cases, even though recently, especially in the 2010s, you've seen some very major victories at the Supreme Court of Canada, like sort of the recognition of the right to strike. So it is, far too easy for unions to sort of rest on their laurels and basically pay lawyers to do their work for them. But if they want to organize something like the gig economy it's going to be something that is going to be obviously, a much longer term project. And then sort of just other things that have to be thought about is sort of the idea of overcoming the entrepreneurial ideology at the heart of gig work, and those who want to do gig work who supplement their income versus full time, and which is obviously something that has to be dealt with. And basically, I think that if gig work can be successfully organized, and also organizing a very diverse workforce in Canada. So that's why I think gig work data is not perfect that StatCan has collected, but it is obviously a very heavily racialized workforce. And I think if you can, organize a diverse workforce in gig work, that can lead to broader transformations in the trade union movement itself. All right, thanks very much.